Good morning, Brian. I'm speaking to Brian Howe, former politician, retired minister and public intellectual. It's good to have you here today, Brian, and I'm going to ask you some questions. This is around what I'm calling living voices, to hear your voice, to hear some of your ideas. Brian, as I said in my introduction, you started in ministry and then you went to politics. Tell me a little bit about where you got to and what led you to that.
Well, I was very influenced by the Methodist Church. Grew up in the Methodist Church. I was brought up by my grandparents, who my grandfather Jack Howe was originally a miner in Eagle Hawk, and then later in Tasmania, and then in the west coast of New Zealand. And he worked in the Tramways Board as a track cleaner throughout his working, the balance of his working life. So I was quite influenced by my grandparents. I think they had a kind of working class background in a sense, although you'd probably describe them as lower middle class, I guess. They'd done quite well. Nice weatherboard house in Malvern, so, pretty good. I think I found growing up very difficult, I must say. I was a very crazy kind of adolescent. But the church was very important. The church at that time, the Methodist Church, had a terrific youth department, fantastic youth programs, wonderful opportunities to learn about all sorts of things through summer schools and Easter camps and all of that. I was very influenced, I suppose, in the church by Alan Walker and the Mission to the Nation. Alan Walker was a Methodist minister in New South Wales. He became the missioner at the main Methodist mission in central Sydney. But Alan Walker himself had been very influenced by the time he'd spent at Cessnock and the conditions in the mining industry in New South Wales. He was very interested in social justice, in developing strategies for change, and he conducted in Australia a mission to the nation in the early 1950s, which was a very, very, very successful exercise, at least for the Methodist Church.
Who is
part of the Christian community in Australia. But that mission of the nation I thought was fantastic, and I was especially impressed by his opening address, I remember, at the Melbourne Town Hall, which I reread recently, and I was interested to find, he was noted as an evangelical and bringing people to the table and all of that. But I think what impressed me when I reread the speech was really how political it was. And I suppose I saw politics and religion pretty much as inseparable after that. Walker expressed the whole gospel for the whole world, and the whole gospel for the whole world meant that religion was about everything. And about every part of life, about the whole of life. And that kind of philosophy was very important to me in my teenage years, the time when I was very unsettled and working out what I want to do in life, I guess.
So from those teenage years, can you give us a brief idea from going from school? What happened beyond that?
Yeah,
was it straight to university?
I went back to school. I started work at the Tramways Board at the head office. Then I went back to school, and after a couple of years at night school, and did matriculation at Melbourne High School, because I decided I wanted to be a Methodist minister. So then I later candidated and then entered Queen's College in the mid-50s, I think 1957 to 60, and then followed a brief period at Eltham, where I was in the local church. I think pretty green at that stage. I still have some contacts out at Eltham, and I wonder what sort of theology, very ill-digested theology that you inflict on congregations when you're very young. But that was quite an interesting period. And from there, Renata and I decided to go to Chicago, her to study at the University of Chicago, and me to study at a theological seminary. Now, the time we had in Chicago between 65 and 67 was absolutely life-transforming. I think until that time, I think I'd been pretty unconfident about whatever it is I was doing, but I think I got a sense of a mission, a sense of what I wanted to do with my life in Chicago. I was very influenced theologically. Of course, I'd always been very keen on Reinhold Niebuhr, and Reinhold Niebuhr's influence in America was very great, and he had a big influence on Saul Alinsky, who was very well known for the Industrial Areas Foundation and developing a theory of community organisation. And I think I saw in Alinsky's theory a possibility of bringing the two things together in a sense of a kind of realistic approach to linking faith to politics and political action. I suppose not so much party politics, more about social reform. So when I came back to Australia in I was trying to think of the time. When I came back to Australia from America in 1969, I had a year in Morwell, and then I came to Fitzroy in a city suburb in Melbourne, and we set up, I guess at my instigation, something called CURA, the Centre for Urban Research and Action. And CURA was the opportunity, in a way, to demonstrate the theories of Alinsky. Now, while Alinsky was very important, and I thought organisation was important, I didn't think it was just organisation alone. I thought one had to be very clear about what one wanted to achieve through organisation. And so I saw research and organisation as really fitting together. So CURA was the Centre for Urban Research and Action. And I thought that the church tended to provide services where the business of the church was to be more of a catalyst. So we thought about CURA that we wouldn't provide any services, but we would be a kind of an enabler, helping people to organise themselves, whether it was in the high-rise flats in Fitzroy, had just been built at that time, or whether it was in the Italian community in the northern suburbs, or whatever we got involved in, we always had a research and an evaluation angle as well as an organisational angle, and we always focused on the empowerment of the people we were working with as opposed to drawing attention so much to ourselves as an organisation. So CURA was in Fitzroy, just over the road from, or over the estate from the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, and I had a lot to do with the Brotherhood at that time. They helped to finance CURA for some of our projects, and we developed a good working relationship. Myself with Peter Hollingworth, who's been a lifelong friend, and David Scott, who was then the director of the Brotherhood of St Lawrence. So in a sense, CURA was a model of combining, I hope, a theological reflection. We produced a journal called Ecstasis, which lasted for probably 10, 15 years, I guess. And Ecstasis was a vehicle for reflecting and thinking about the action that we were taking and the positions that we're adopting. We produced a great pile of studies which are on the floor at home. Renata's sort of looking at those studies to think about how we might publish some of them again. And in a sense, there was a model for politics. And
so the step then was to go into party politics for you?
Not initially. I think in 1975, at that time I was the minister of the church in Fitzroy, but I worked at Swinburne University, or Institute of Technology at that time, so that freed up my stipend to employ some researchers at CURA. And so using the same model in 1975, following that political defeat, I had always been a member of the Labor Party from the moment I entered the parish at Eltham. So we set up something called the Labour Resource Centre, which was a bit similar, if you like, to CURA. And that's, I mentioned to you before that the Labour Resource Centre gave me as insight into government factories and industrial democracy. And when I decided to go into politics in 1977, I had that kind of background and kind of a methodology, in a sense, that was important later in politics.
So the move into politics comes out of your commitment to social justice, commitment to a fairer society. But that move must have been quite special in that you're confronted by some new issues. I have been told that you were very much a door knocker, go around, meet the people, talk to all the members of the party in those early days. What were your recollections of those early days of moving into politics?
Well, that was quite. I was very passionate about Whitlam. I thought Whitlam was a great leader, and I thought it was very unfair, the dismissal and so on. So I guess that's how I made the change. I got so caught up in that I thought there wasn't really much alternative. I had to try and. Now I wasn't expected to win a seat, but I did win a seat, I think, because I was very thorough in terms of preparation for the pre-selection. I had 2 pre-selections because of a change of boundaries. And then in the Parliament, first as a member, I thought it was very important to consolidate and to, as you said, to become someone who got to know and got involved in the communities that were part of the electorate of Batman. So I remember we created a kind of second, almost a voluntary office out at West Heidelberg, which I remember we had it was like a garden shop. We had all these flowers that garden plants that we managed to acquire from the local nursery, and we sold plants, but we got to know the local community. And I always tried to, in the time before I became a minister, I tried to work very hard at the community level. I've always believed passionately that change doesn't come from above, change comes from below. And if you can get movements going, then there's no, there's no no end, in a sense, the possibility of growing more and more. And so I think my experience with Cura and then my experience at the electorate set me up pretty well for developing a way of working in politics. So in 1983 I became, I was the last person elected. It was surprising in a way that I made the ministry. Hadn't made, I don't think, a great mark in Canberra, but I managed to scrape into the ministry, number 27. So I was the last minister. Bob had interviewed all the other 26 ministers before me, and then he said, you'll be defence support. And I said, well, I don't know much about defence. I used to get out and do it. So I got the defence...
Just to interrupt you there, a pacifist Christian minister finds himself as a defence support minister.
They thought that, at least. I mean, I was a student of Reinhold Niebuhr, so I wasn't entirely a pacifist, but they thought that. I think I did quite well in defence support because we were interested. We had a philosophy of how that might be approached of industrial democracy, and rather than talking so much to the management, I made a practice of talking to the people on the shop floor, and we got their ideas about how we might move forward. And I was also very passionate in defence industry money being spent in Australia, and through an offsets program that we developed, I was able to raise the level of defence expenditure in Australia from around 30% to close to 70% in a couple of years, in a very short period of time. So I think that was noticed, and in the 84, after the 84 election, which we didn't do so well in, but after that election, Bob asked me to take on Social Security. And of course that was a huge opportunity. That represented a very large share of the federal budget, and also of course with my interests in social policy and social justice, nothing could have been more suited to my interests. I found that pretty difficult, and especially early on, I found it difficult to work with the department in terms of bringing about policy reform. I found the stuff that was being put up to me was pretty weak and not going to take us anywhere, and so I decided to develop something called the Social Security Review, which I recruited Bettina Cass, who is an academic at the University of Sydney, and I knew that she had a very broad perspective on social policy, and I thought she'd do a pretty good job with the review. So that basically meant in the time I was in Social Security, I always had an agenda. You know, the review was a pretty comprehensive review of the system, and so as we worked our way through it, I said, well, look, you don't have to worry about the money side, don't make recommendations about money. But I had to work out how to raise the funds to do positive reform, knowing that I'd have to rely pretty largely on the money that was in that portfolio. And so that was quite a tricky political challenge, but one I think that I learnt that in politics evidence is very important, and it was very important to have counter-arguments to the Finance Treasury arguments that came from the other side of the room in the Expenditure Review Committee. I mean, this is time of very, very tight budgets, you know, surplus after surplus being delivered in the 1980s. And in a sense, I think I might have been given Social Security because they thought you wouldn't be able to do very much. Whereas I worked particularly on the issue of child poverty, which has been very controversial. Do you mind if I just say a word about that?
No,
because,
go ahead, because this is the time.
Child poverty.
Spoke about
when you
no
start
child.
in a job like this, what's your starting point? Well, my starting point was I convened a meeting at ANU. I had a friend convene a meeting at ANU of who I thought might be the best people, best social policy minds in the country. You know, if you're a minister in the federal government, you're more or less anyone's be enthusiastic, be involved. So we had this discussion, and it was a butcher paper type discussion, butcher's papers on the wall, and gradually people worked their way through until the end. In the last piece of butcher's paper had at the bottom a guaranteed minimum income for children. So Henderson had done the poverty inquiry a few years before, and Henderson's ideas are very much in people's minds, and so this idea of a GMI for children came through. So I said, well, okay, to Bettina, what you're going to look at first are families and children. And we found that Henderson really hadn't given a lot of thought to that side of... Well, Henderson's really looking at poverty rather than the social security system. And in a way, the reforms in the social security system hadn't really gone to so much family payments. And so we got some work done to look with Bettina and with Peter Whiteford, an expert from the University of New South Wales, looking at how you could set a standard for child payments for the poorest families, but also for families that were, you know, doing it hard out there in the workforce, people on low incomes and so on. And so out of that came a concept of a family allowance supplement, which was introduced, I think, in the 1985-86 budget, probably the 86 budget after the election. And that dramatically increased child payments progressively over years, but so it increased child payments more rapidly than in any other country in the OECD. So it was very rapid, and child payments in Australia, which had been relatively poor compared to other countries, became in the top 4 or 5 countries in the OECD in that period. Now, of course, Bob Hawke had made the famous statement that no child need live in poverty, And technically, I think that was correct, because the way Henderson had talked about poverty, he always talked about it in income terms. But when the statement was made, I think there was some cynicism about Hawke's statement, because his budgets were all tough and his line was tough. Nothing that the front bench liked better than giving the opposition a lecture on how tough they were on all sorts of payments. So, in a sense, I had to shut up. I couldn't say very much and couldn't enter into the debate. But I did get rather annoyed with the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, who'd give me a lot of help at that time.
Okay, Brian, let's start the decline of politics and moving out of politics. That is always an interesting process. I haven't heard too many politicians talk about leaving and what it means to them. How did you feel, and what was your experience during that time?
Well, I thought I'd probably done a pretty good job, really. I was inclined to think that I might write a book on, what a good job I'd done. Everyone else seemed to be doing that.
Yes, of course they did.
And, of course, they usually have someone to help them. And I had a young person called Anthony O'Donnell who was going to help me write something. And then I thought, well, I'll go off to Princeton and I'll read, because in politics you tend to live off your capital. So I thought, well, I'll go to the seminary and I'll find out what the theologians are saying, and I'll be at the university and see what the policy people are saying. And I think after I'd been there a little while, I decided that my ideas when I'd been in government were, to say the least, pretty conservative, and perhaps didn't reflect the depth of problems that we were facing in Australia and in Western countries at that time. So I really got rather fired up about a different direction, if you like, in social policy than necessarily the one that I'd taken in government. I thought that we needed to be rethinking different aspects of government. So in a sense, behind whatever other things I've done, I've been involved in
Sorry for those who are listening. That was my phone going off and rudely interrupting Brian. But Brian, continue, because you're talking about your time at Princeton.
So I thought, well, we needed to rethink issues. I thought that the nature of employment had changed quite fundamentally. And later I had the opportunity to chair an inquiry for the ACT on insecure work. More recently, I've been thinking about the concept of guaranteed minimum income, or universal basic income, it's now called. It seems to me that the welfare system has become impossibly conditional. People have to satisfy so many conditions, and rather than the most disadvantaged, we always said the great strength of the Australian social security system is it looked after people at the bottom of the pile. I found that increasingly the social security system was doing worst at the people who are in the most trouble, especially the unemployed. And so we organised a conference earlier this year on universal basic income at Melbourne University, but also looking at the social security system. And I'm now thinking about how we can restore some fundamental principles to the social security system, whether that takes the form of universal basic income or something. It should be less conditional on all these requirements on so-called reciprocal obligation. It should be more designed to ensure that people are able to cross the bridge, if you like, from one state to another, from unemployment to employment, or from a marriage breakdown to being able to rejoin the workforce, or incurring a disability to being able to go through a process of rehabilitation, and so on. I was very influenced by Gunter Schmidt, the German social scientist, who talks about transitional labour markets. By that he means that people through the life course, constantly have to make transitions, and they're often very difficult, and it's during those transitions people often fall over. So I think we've got, in the welfare to work kind of language, we've got the wrong end of the stick. We need to think of transitions as being much more normal, sort of thing that everyone has to go through at some stage in their life, and government should facilitate those transitions so you have a good, or what Gunter would call a good transition, a successful transition, rather than people ending up in disaster.
Fantastic things, and you're obviously still thinking about all of these things, even though you're well and truly retired. But my experience is you haven't really retired, because you are still pushing them and prodding us to think further down. You've seen incredible changes in Australia during your time. Do you have any reflections to how you see Australia changing and developing during your time, both in ministry and in politics, and now in retirement?
Well, I think in theology you learn to be very critical of the optimists. I think that there's a sense in which, economics is often described as the dismal science, but in a sense, I think economists increasingly become the optimists. In a sense, it doesn't matter what change may be doing to people, they will always say it's all going to come out right in the end. If you think about the Industrial Revolution, well, the Industrial Revolution put people through hell for a century, but ultimately, yes, people did do better, but the hell was pretty serious. It was terrible. And I think, in a way, change is very problematic. I think for younger people in Australia now, life is much more difficult than it was in my youth. Now, I thought life was pretty difficult in my youth, and life wasn't easy, although you could get a job, but in many ways, sorting yourself out then was very, very difficult. Incomes were low and so on. Today, I think for those that get first class honours at the university and all of that, well, sure, the opportunities are absolutely endless. For those that struggle a bit in terms of the transition from, well, even completing school, people who don't complete secondary education, their chances of having an interrupted working life are much higher than people that complete secondary education. So I think the challenges for young people are never been more formidable. Strangely enough, now we are rewarding the aged, who in a sense don't need a lot of resources in terms of living resources. We're massive increase in the age pension delivered, but at the other end of the spectrum, for younger people struggling to get established in the labour market, the cost of housing is incredible. People are being asked to pay for their own health insurance much earlier, to pay back the costs of their education, to defer very often relationships and marriage until much later than people would prefer, to defer having children, to not having as many children as people might prefer to have, and so on. In a way, the transition to adult life is more difficult now than it's probably been in the last century.
Thank you for sharing that, Brian. Before we finish our time together, there are two more questions. These are a little bit more esoteric, but should you get to the pearly gates and God is waiting for you there, which we hope we will all do,
sure, that is a rather
the deep theological question.
Well, I suppose that in a sense you can say there's no justice. That in the world that we have, there's both good and evil, and very often it's those who don't have the highest standards who seem to be doing best. So that I think we're taught to pursue the high road, but the high road, of course, is the suffering servant of the servant Lord. The high road, we're not really promised that we're going to prosper in the conventional sense. We may inherit eternal life, but we're not going to prosper necessarily. So I think that the world's not a perfect world, and I guess I suppose that that's what the incarnation is really all about, understanding the mystery of the imperfection of a world created by God.
Final question. It's a question I think all modern interviewers are asking. and not to give away too many secrets, but you're in your 80s now. What advice would you give to a 9-year-old Brian Howe about the world from your perspective now? To yourself, if you were 9 years old, looking out at the world, what advice would you give?
Well, I think joining is very important. I think we put too much emphasis on the individual, and I think in my life, nothing I've done have I done on my own. I've done it always with a group of friends, a group of people in the church, a group of people in politics, people that I felt I could work with. So in a sense, I think I don't feel like I've done things. I think I've been very fortunate to be part of churches, part of communities, part of political parties, part of groups that have worked to achieve change that reflect my values.
Brian Howe, thank you for your time. And if you're listening to this by podcast, I would encourage you to listen to our future podcast. But thank you for your time, Brian.